This is the kind of art that people make cosplays out of. Hi guys, and welcome back to Style Study Month. I'll try to keep the intro brief. Today's video was a request by one of you lovely viewers, Toxic Leaks, and it was a request to cover the style of popular character artist Astri Lohne. I generally do my style studies in 3 parts. In part 1, we will analyze the work of Astri and see what we can learn from her style. In part 2, we do a study of one of Astri's original paintings. The reference I chose was this one. And in part 3, we'll apply everything that we learned today to an original painting of our own. As always, if you enjoyed this video, then please remember to give me a big thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and without much further ado, grab a snack, sit back, and let's jump into another style study featuring Astri Lohne.
Astri Lohne is a 22-year-old artist from Norway, though I believe she currently lives in Dublin, or so her ArtStation profile says. She currently works as a senior illustrator and concept artist at videogame and has previously been commissioned by firms like Blizzard, Sci-Fi and Disney. Though she doesn't share too much of a personal life on her social media, I managed to find one single photo of hers on the videogame's website. She's had a YouTube channel for about 5 years, and though she doesn't post super often, her gorgeous art has garnered her over 60,000 subscribers on YouTube, as well as over 114,000 subscribers on Instagram. Astri's art is what I would classify as fantasy realism character illustrations. Although the majority of her characters have a fairly humanoid appearance, there are a ton of magical elements that help create high fantasy scenes and tell detailed stories within a single painting. Quick question, what do you get when you take a gun away from a linguist? Here are 4 key characteristics of Astri's work. Before we even get to the details and stylistic choices, the first thing that pops out at you in Astri's work is the dramatic mood setting. No matter what the light source, no matter what the storyline, Astri is a complete pro at creating a very strong sense of mood in her work. Because although a lot of the light in her portraits is fairly diffused, there are very dramatic value shifts between the highlights and the shadows. In other words, there are some very dark darks and some very bright lights, but you almost can't tell where one ends and the other begins because there is usually a very soft, very smooth gradient of midtones in between the extreme values. Be it foreground elements or the further away backgrounds, be it an indoor scene or an outdoor vista, there is always an element of drama. The blending gives you the illusion of the lights being diffused, but the massive separation between the darkest and lightest values create that drama. Put them together and you already have a strong sense of mood. But then Astri takes this another step forward and adds in secondary light sources. These are the more saturated, more concentrated, smaller areas of light. Sometimes they're subtle, staying far in the background, but other times they directly impact the character, creating a high saturation rim or bounce light. And sure, this adds an extra pop of color, but it has a bigger purpose than that. We'll look at this again in just a little bit. But no matter what the light source, Astri makes sure to blend the edges of it really well so that everything is still super diffused and uniform. This creates a more ethereal effect, particularly on the skin. Smooth blends cause the skin to look very soft and untextured. Remember, textures and imperfections add realism to any character or object you paint. So when you don't see strong textures, it creates this otherworldly glow on the surface. Okay, so now that we have the abstract idea out of the way, let's look at some of the more specific stylistic choices. When it comes to the characters, the overall proportions are pretty much realistic plus some fantasy elements. So the face itself has very realistic features in that the eyes, the nose and the mouth are often in the right sizes and positions that you would find in an ordinary human face. Same applies to the body proportions, where you'll likely find that these characters all have very believable, very idealistic bodies. Where the magic comes in, however, is in the extra fantasy elements. One of the most common elements you'll see in Astri's work are the super long, super pointy elf ears. Astri loves her elves, and as far as I could find, those are the most commonly portrayed characters in her portfolio. However, you will also find other magical elements such as glowing eyes, tusks, and non-human skin tones. But again, all of these features are generally in addition to the natural human proportions of the face and the body. If anything, the common stylistic choices I could find on the face are that the eyes are placed quite high on the head, along with high cheekbones and a strong defined jaw. Now, if you've watched a lot of my style studies, you'll notice that heavily stylized work often has the opposite of every one of these features. So you would have very large eyes that are set fairly low on the face, little to no visible bone structure, and narrow jaws with pointy chins. So I'm thinking along the lines of Rostraws or Shall-E or Lowish. But with Astri's work, the lack of this extreme stylism is what makes me feel like her work is a lot more geared towards realistic proportions. Idealistic faces and bodies, but nothing too stylized or unrealistic. Every piece that Astri makes, even if it is a simple grayscale sketch, tells a story. Even something as simple as a character bust with very little to no background is heavily packed with storytelling elements. In concrete terms, you'll see this in the costumes and jewelry, the hair and makeup, maybe some tribal paint and tattoo, some floating elements like flower petals and dust, or the background scene itself. More subtle storytelling occurs through the character's expression and stance. The way someone dresses up and carries themselves tells us a lot about their personality, and the vast majority of Astri's characters are posed in a way that exudes confidence and comfort within their own skin. These characters know what they're capable of and are strong in their identity. But in an even more abstract sense, the biggest storytelling element by far is the composition. Part of this is how the elements are arranged, as well as how the perspective is set up. In every illustration, the character is either at level with or slightly above the viewer's gaze, in that you're likely looking up at the character. In fact, I was hard-pressed to find many illustrations where you're looking down at the character. One of the only ones I found was this one, and it is a powerful contrast to all the other paintings. Here, because the character is positioned below the horizon, as the viewer, you are looking down at her, and that really serves to push the narrative of her being in trouble. When a character is placed below the horizon, it gives you, the viewer, a sense of having a higher standing. This is subtle, but the perspective really gives you an idea of whether the character is more or less powerful, depending on whether you're looking up or down at them, respectively. But the other strong element of the composition, as we saw in the first point, is the lighting. Think of a scenario where you had to go get professional headshots taken for an ID card or a passport or a driver's license. In a professional photo studio, they generally have large diffuse lights pointing at you head-on, creating a very flat, very well-lit portrait. You'll likely see no shadows at all because all of the light is coming from one direction, and that is head-on. However, reality is rarely so controlled or perfect. If, say, you were to go out on a warm day, you would encounter strong sunlight. but because it is a singular light source, it will cast directional shadows. And if you moved, the shadows would move with you. And then you'd have the bounce light from the sky or grass, maybe even little reflections from some jewelry that bounces off of your skin. Now imagine going out to a city at night. Here you don't really have a solid light source anymore. Now it gets a little more complicated. Now you're likely bathed in a beam of light from some street lamps, maybe some colorful LEDs on signboards, the soft glow of your phone screen, and the passing glare of headlights as vehicles drive by. The point I'm trying to make is that in realistic situations, you rarely have one diffuse source of uniform monochromatic light. So when Astri adds multiple narrower, more saturated light sources along with the main diffused key light, it isn't just to add some interest or color variation. It is to sell the realism of the piece. Because when you see elves or humanoid characters with horns and glowing eyes, you automatically think there is no way that this is real. But it's all these other more subtle elements of storytelling within the piece that make you believe that maybe, just maybe, there might be a universe where these characters might be as real as you or me. And that, my friends, is the difference between just making up fantasy characters versus building entire worlds where these characters have real lives and real stories. So we know that Astri loves her soft gradated blends, but if you look at her work, you'll notice that it isn't just one giant melting pot of color. There are still strong contrasts in there that prevent the art from looking muddy and keeping everything very readable. And one of the biggest tools she uses in order to create contrast is to use a variety of materials. Technically, this is still very much part of the storytelling aspect, but I did want to give it its own point. In every single painting, you'll see that Astri renders a bunch of different materials, particularly ones that would contrast each other really nicely. So softer, more abstract materials like fabric, fur, hair and foliage are contrasted with harder, sturdier materials such as metal, wood, leather and gemstones. And I actually found that in between contrasting materials is where you will find almost all of the hard edges. So in the ambient occlusion between, say, fabric and skin or leather and metal is where you would find the most sharpness in the rendering. Within each material, though there is often a sense of texture, there are only a few hard edges unless it is part of the manufacturing design. Again, this is a huge part of storytelling, but looking a little deeper, this is also a massive tool used to introduce smaller, more rhythmic shapes into the composition. Because the rendering within these shapes is so smooth, Astri uses smaller, detailed shapes to break up the composition, making it feel more balanced. Always remember, the key to any good composition lies in balance. If you have dark elements, you need lighter ones. If you have soft materials, you need harder shapes. If you have large, sprawling surfaces, you need smaller details. An unbalanced composition appears incredibly monotonous and, dare I say it, boring, and Astri's art is anything but. So, to sum up, here are the 4 main characteristics of Astri's work. Number 1. Before even getting to the details, the first thing that jumps out at you is the dramatic mood conveyed through strong value shifts. 2. The characters have fairly realistic human proportions and then have additional fantasy elements. Number 3. Each illustration is jam-packed with storytelling elements, often involving the costume, composition, and multiple light sources, in order to build entire worlds around the characters themselves. And number 4, Astri creates a very balanced, active composition by rendering contrasting materials in order to create interest and believability while also telling powerful stories. So for the study portion of this video, I picked this reference. It is a fan art Astri did of Illyria Windrunner from the World of Warcraft franchise. I guess me doing a study of it is basically fan art of fan art, so fanception? Anyway, it was hard to find a reference that wasn't a commissioned piece and wasn't super complex either. This one felt like a decent compromise. Like I mentioned, Astri doesn't alter the basic facial proportions too much, so the initial sketch was quite similar to how I usually sketch out faces. But the magic comes in after that because there are loads of little story elements scattered all around Illyria's face. So of course you have the elf ears and the eyebrows, but you also have the jewelry, 2 kinds of fabric, metal lining on the breastplate, some feathers and a braid and loose hair at the same time. Safe to say it's been a minute since I've rendered so many materials within the same painting, so this was definitely a challenge, albeit a more technical one rather than a stylistic one. In other words, this painting really brought it to me, particularly in the rendering phase. You'll see me go back and forth with the proportions in the liquify tool and bounce around with the contrast towards the end because the colors were muted yet bright and saturated. It was a bit of a juxtaposition that had me hot and bothered for quite a while. But this is the reason why I started this series back in 2019, was to explore new techniques and methods of rendering. And shout out to my friend for reminding me of this purpose. You know who you are. In either case, it took me a little bit to get the likeness right, but all in all, this piece turned out pretty cool. So arguably, this painting was way easier than the study, mostly because I wasn't trying to achieve a likeness. This was actually a really important lesson for me, so I figured I'd share it with you. The more realistic a face is, the harder it is to achieve a likeness. The more stylized the face is, the easier it gets to achieve a likeness. Why? Because realistic faces trip us up. We subconsciously know a real human face and how it moves and shifts, and this can really get in the way of replicating what we see because we're hindered by what we think we should be seeing. The less familiar an object is, the easier it is to replicate said object because we have no preconceived notions about what it should look like. This is why it is way easier to draw a face upside down and get a better resemblance to your subject. Upside down, everything is only shapes and lines. We don't really know upside down faces well enough to have preconceived ideas of what they should look like. So it's easier to only draw or paint what we actually see. Okay, that was a bit of a ramble, but I really felt like I needed to share this with you guys. If you're struggling with not being able to achieve a good resemblance when you draw more realistically, as opposed to a more stylized or a cartoony way, it is perfectly normal, and with time and practice, you'll get really good at it. Until then, if you're doing a rush portrait job, just paint it upside down. It works in a pinch. So with that said, here is today's original painting. As always, you can grab this one as downloads, wallpapers for desktops and mobile, and printables, all on my Patreon. Link is in the description below.
And there we have it, Astri Lohne demystified. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and if you have found it helpful, then please remember to give me a big thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below and the notification bell, because remember, we have 2 more style studies to come this month. Comment below which artists you'd like to see on this series and I'll add it to my list. As you can clearly tell, I do make these happen. Thanks so much to Toxic Leaks again for requesting this topic. I hope I've done it even just a modicum of justice. As always, if you haven't watched this series before, I'll leave all of my style studies in a playlist up here. Check them out, they're all really good and really informative. But with all of that said, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I did, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye!